I talk to my community and the writers that I work with that writing is healing, but it's not always healing. It's not always helpful. We can actually write in a way that can harm us sometimes, especially journaling if we're not careful. And I think that's where some people can get really stuck, or they can just realize like, oh, like this is not working for me. What's going on?
All right. Well, welcome to the Writers Bloc Podcast. I am so excited to have Kristin Vanderlip with us today. Kristin is a bereaved mother and a veteran Army wife who knows firsthand what it means to walk through the hardest seasons of life. And now, through her prose and pastels, she loves to help other women find healing and hope. She's the founder of the Pen and Mend Collective. I love that name. And author of Rest, a journal for lament. So we're going to talk today a little bit about grief and growth and journaling, and how all of those things working together helps us heal. So welcome, Kristin. We're so glad to have you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I always enjoy having these conversations, so it is my pleasure to be here with you.
Oh, well, we're honored to have you. And I mean, I shared a little bit about you in that intro, but tell us a little bit more about your story. I'm sure people are curious about what kind of led you into this really hard space of grief and lament.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation to just have a conversation about this. I'm so open about this. This is part of what I do, but I just really appreciate other people, environments, communities who are willing to talk about grief and the hard things that we will all experience, but for some reason our culture is so averse to, or we can be. So we all have our hard stories. We all have our different encounters with grief. And many times it's not a one-time thing. There are all sorts of big and little losses we can have throughout our life. And for me, I will say, since I was little and could hold a pen or a pencil, I identified as a writer. So writing has always been something a part of me, but it really wasn't until I went through a deep season of capital G grief, capital T trauma, of losing our first child, our daughter. And for me, that came at a time when it was completely unexpected in how I thought life should go. I was 24 years old, newly married, just starting off on the happily ever after, first home, first dog, first job, happy married life. And just the next sequence of that happily ever after was, starting a family, having children. And unfortunately, our daughter was born with a fatal genetic condition that we didn't learn until a week or two after she was born and we were in the NICU. She had a condition called full trisomy 18. And for those who are familiar, but many are unfamiliar, it is a genetic condition that is fatal, and most babies who have it do not survive birth. They're not full term. Many, they just will. I remember specifically one of the doctors telling us there's a 0% chance that your daughter will live to see her first birthday.
Wow.
And we were having this tremendous amount of joy, a joy in meeting our daughter and welcoming our first child, and so much love and beautiful emotions. And then there was this cascading just grief that just it was like I was drowning in that grief even early on. And so that experience of child loss, of losing our daughter, combined with the death of my father 2 weeks later, combined with moving as a military spouse, being away from our long-term communities. It was a year of just many losses and many forms of grief. And to cope with that amount of grief, I will say requires a lot of different tools and support. And lament is something that I didn't know what it was called. I didn't know that it had a name for it. I just started doing it in a faith practice. And over the years, as life, I had more healing and life, started new chapters, so to speak. There were also more chapters of loss and pain and new forms of big G, capital G grief. And kind of the second wave of grief in my life, really, I just felt like I didn't know I could go any lower than the death of my child. And then this other very private grief, it just felt like it took me under even deeper, and it surprised me in some devastating ways. And despair had really moved into my life at one point. And it was through this combination of going to something that's always been a part of me, writing, and being supported through my faith and being supported through therapists, that I began to use journaling as this form of lament and this spiritual pathway to help me really survive those darkest days and eventually kind of find my way back to my life and all sorts of other healing things like that. So my story, child loss, it's devastating. It's a lot of people's worst nightmares. It was my worst nightmare. And like I said, there's been other forms of grief as well, the loss of a family member, moving, all of that to say. So I just want to say I've had a lot of layers of grief in my life. And some are very unique to me. And then I know for those in your community, some people might resonate and some people might be tempted to compare griefs. So I just want to put like a little disclaimer in here really quick that we don't need to measure suffering and grief or dismiss our own pain because we think somebody's maybe had it worse. So if anybody here is listening, you've likely lost something and there's probably a grief there and it matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that. Those are really, like, I think you said it well, capital G, capital T, grief and trauma. And so we just want to say thank you for sharing that. And I know God has and is and will continue to redeem that. And I know He doesn't waste any of our sufferings in this life, and they point us to our eternal heavenly hope. And I know that you have that, but even still,
Mhm.
that those are hard, lonely roads to walk. And
Yeah.
yeah, you mentioned in there just feeling like that sense of drowning, and then it was like wave upon wave of new trial, new suffering. Um, when you were in those places, those kind of dark places, um, I mean, we're talking about journaling today, and I realize that that's like one little element of this healing process. I don't mean to make it sound like, this heals all wounds, but I know it was part of your healing process.
Mm.
And so, um, how did that work out for you? Because I know for myself, there are times when, like, writing is a very therapeutic exercise, and then there's times when,
Mhm.
like, I have zero desire to do it, and maybe you felt that way too, and over time, you were able to kind of start to introduce that. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about what that process was like for you?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Because I think you're right. It's just always nice to just have that little just moment of reminder of while we're talking about journaling, it is certainly not the answer, the solution, the, you know, only healing practice out there. It is part of a toolkit of
Right,
practices,
yeah.
right? And it is one I'm really passionate about. And for me, journaling became healing because there were certain pains that, like you had mentioned, it felt lonely at times. And there were people in my life and there was community, but there is also a lot that we can be asked to carry and work through on our own. And um, in the times of loneliness, here's an example. I had worked with a therapist who was very, very helpful. He was a professor at Yale. Um, he was this warm grandfather-like figure, and I had started working with him weekly, and I realized these sessions were great, but I needed something to meet me every day in this season in between the sessions. And I needed a way to put into practice the different tools and skills I was learning. And in my faith practices, prayer and morning scripture had also always been a part of this. And so I realized I needed to show up to my life every day, and that that taking one day at a time became really essential for me, and to do that on my own in a lot of ways, to have a practice that kind of met me in a space of loneliness, by giving me my own voice and by helping me start to recognize God's voice on the page. It was like that daily way that I had to start to both express what I was thinking and feeling and find that receiving. So it was a writing practice for the healing aspect that did have to involve an amount of pouring out and then being filled. And so, I talk to my community and the writers that I work with that writing is healing, but it's not always healing. It's not always helpful. We can actually write in a way that can harm us sometimes, especially journaling if we're not careful. And I think that's where some people can get really stuck, or they can just realize like, oh, like this is not working for me. What's going on? And so for me, I would also struggle with rumination at times, or I would just kind of get locked on like what I'd call a sticky thought. And so there was a way that through, again, like incorporating biblical laments and the structure of it and incorporating different, I'm like blanking on the therapeutic model. Dialectical behavioral therapy is part of the therapy that I was doing. And so it's kind of working with your thoughts and framing them. And so I realized like I was just going to write what the thought was. I was just going to express what the emotion was. And then I need to find a way to turn it and to move out of it. So I don't just keep saying the same thing over and over, or I don't go deeper and deeper and deeper into the feeling. Or another example would be when you're in a place of grief or emotional pain or physical pain and you pull out a journal to help. If you're not paying attention to your body's cues, you can also start to re-traumatize yourself or get locked into like a trauma memory. And for me, part of my experience has been anxiety and panic attacks. It would be very easy for me if I'm not careful to journal in a way where I would just spiral out, anxious
Mm,
thoughts abounding, like not helpful. So as I began to kind of just learn some new strategies that I could weave into my journaling time to give myself some guardrails and kind of like a loose framework to really validate myself and find a way to articulate myself and give myself voice and compassion, I had to find a way to, though, also turn them. So that is a big part of kind of what I like to incorporate into my journals, my community, what I talk about in terms of healing. It has to involve a level of, honesty, curiosity, compassion. I would say those would probably be my big three kind of values to incorporate if somebody's looking to make that journaling a healing practice. And so for me, over time, as I was moving through kind of these darker, grief heavy, saturated seasons, showing up day by day, letting all of this inner world that was in a turmoil come out on the page, I started to find some of those research backed benefits of writing and journaling, kind of what was going on in my life.
mm. I think that's really helpful because, yeah, there is a sense in which there's a type of um, grief and processing of grief that's helpful, and probably even using a good tool can often doesn't always lead to a good result because we can get stuck in those cycles of rumination, as you called it.
Yeah.
And I mean, you also mentioned lament, and maybe you could tell us a little bit. We had Glenna Marshall on a couple weeks ago, and she was talking to us about lament, and kind of gave us a definition of that as well. But I would love to hear from you, like what do you think of lament? How do you define it, and how is that part of your spiritual practice? Because maybe for some, they might hear that and be like, "Oh, wait, there's a space within our faith for lament, and how does that work itself out?"
Yeah, yeah, these are great questions. So I'll start by offering some context for my own background in terms of when I encountered deep grief and deep suffering. Um, I I didn't feel quite prepared for it in some ways, and I was really in kind of this. I'd internalized this messaging that really, I do think, distorted some interpretations of scripture, that ultimately I think harmed my personal faith journey with God. And it was kind of this context of doubt is sinful. If you're anxious, you're not trusting God, there's something wrong with your faith. If you're weak in faith, there's something wrong with you, you're sinful. Um, choose joy. Where is the space for grief? It was really like all of this, a lot of toxic positivity, a lot of shame around spiritual wrestling or suffering. And when, I moved through that traumatic encounter of losing a child. I mean, you go through something that's capital T traumatic, it's going to just wash everything else away that does not stand up. And it was really a refinement of my own personal theology. And in my studying of scripture, that is where I just found there is so much space made for grief. There is so much space where we can see this allowance for human emotions, and we don't have to hide them from God. We don't have to filter ourselves. We don't have to present ourselves as perfectly fine in order to go to his presence. There was just this moment in grief of recognizing God already knows everything already about what I am going through, and I have full permission to come as I am to him, which is completely brokenhearted. And during that season, it was really the book of Psalms I turned to first. And in the book of Psalms, we encounter a lot of examples of biblical lament. And so lament is this, it's typically, in my studying of it, just the definition of lament is kind of this like guttural, groaning cry of expressive pain. It doesn't necessarily have words. But in biblical lament, we see it as, I kind of call it as like a pathway to God. If our pain and suffering feels like it is like this valley or chasm between us and God, lament is like the pathway. Lament is the language that God allows us to speak with him, to move through that pain and suffering. And so the Psalms kind of allowed me to have some language to borrow and to mirror, where I can see emotional honesty. I can find expression, poetic expression, doesn't have to be poetic, but expression of that pain or grief in words. And to find that framework that starts to turn us, to pivot us towards this hopeless space, towards finding that anchor and the hope and the trust of God and his character and his promises. And my journal for lament rest that I created, it kind of is a study of biblical lament that follows a four-part structure. Different authors and creatives and theologians even will kind of talk about biblical lament. Some might break it down into 4 parts, 6 parts, 9 parts, but ultimately it is kind of this you have this way of turning towards God in your pain. You are not going to run away from him. You're not going to hide. You get to actually go to God, turn towards him, express him openly and honestly, or express yourself openly and honestly to him. And then you're invited to find um, um, oh, what is the word that I'm looking for? Like you can make your requests known, you can ask for help, you can pour out all of those cries of your heart, and then you can begin to turn towards not so much your grief in your heart, but kind of start to pivot it toward God's heart for you, and to receive his compassion. And so that's a little bit of the difference between just kind of a general idea of lament and a biblical idea of lament. Biblical lament really will tie your heart into that hope, but it doesn't do it where it's like, just choose joy, just be
Right.
happy, just know, just be hopeful, it allows the process of honesty and curiosity and just dependence on God and reliance on God, that you get to have all of that grit before you can encounter his grace and his goodness, which for me, and I know so many others, is so cathartic when we are humans who are hurting in this world.
Yeah. I loved the way you described that was really beautiful, and I hadn't quite thought of it in some of the terms that you
Mm.
framed it in, and I appreciate that because I think we tend to, I don't know, lament feels a little scary sometimes, but you were talking about it as kind of, this is a pathway. This is a way that we are able to connect with God, and we do see that pattern in scripture, especially in the Psalms, like you mentioned, where David, for example, is grieving and he sees no hope on the horizon. And it's like the sky is falling, but then he turns his face. And I mean, he's expressing all of this feeling before the
Mhm.
Lord. And then there's a turning, right? There's the turning that happens in the midst of that lament. And so, I mean, I think it's so sweet that God gives us um, all of these examples in scripture and then in real life where you
Mhm.
can see people who honestly and like before God express themselves in a way that is like in a no judgment sort of way, like being honest and before the Lord and letting him turn your heart because yeah, like you said, like the choose joy is actually harmful to somebody who needs to go through that process
Mhm.
of grief and lament. So, yeah,
Yeah.
I appreciate the way that you kind of framed that for us. So, when you're going through that and expressing that pain, how does that how does that work itself out with journaling, specifically? And can you tell us a little bit more because you mentioned your journals, and I know that that is something that, probably came out of your own experience, but, like, how does the journaling practice and the lament help you to process biblically and with hope?
Yeah. So there's actually some neuroscience and psychology behind it, which is interesting to me, where if we don't, and it's like this is what God knows about us, right? Like we are actually wired to have emotions and to be expressive. And when we're going through an experience or we're feeling an emotion, we can get scared of them, right? Like you
Mhm.
mentioned, like lament can sound scary, grief sounds scary. A lot of these feelings we actually don't want to have them, but it is actually necessary for us to have some emotional intelligence and awareness to just notice and name what is this emotion? What is this I'm feeling right now? And to know what choices we have in that feeling, because I don't believe that our emotions are the enemy, but we also do want to find a way to guide ourselves and to allow God's direction in our experiences as well. So, um, there's research about this where if we are not being honest about our emotional experiences or we're suppressing them, it literally actually makes us sick. Not only, weary in spirit and like just deeply sad in our souls, but like physically sick. Like autoimmune disorders can be caused by all of this suppression, this avoidance, this pushing away, this trying to like white knuckle it, this whatever is happening. If we don't have a healthy, safe outlet to express ourselves, it really is going to harm us in a lot of different ways, spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally. And so journaling is I love it, not just because I'm a writer, but because it is one available to almost all of us. Almost all of us can pick up paper and pen and start to journal. If we can't, there's wonderfully adaptive tools where we can use talk to text and other things. But it is a practical tool that gives us this form of safe expression on the page. Um, Sometimes, right, if we think about anger, for example, what is a healthy demonstration of anger? So many of us have not really been modeled this, right? We think of people who are just dysregulated in anger as, putting their fist in a wall, or, I want to like throw a plate, and we don't want to do that, right? That's not like the God spirit in us that wants to do that. But then, like, what do we do about the real anger or rage we might feel? Or again, like whatever emotion we have, what do we do with it? What's the healthy outlet? Some of us are runners, and we might go run, and like running is a great way and an embodied practice to move emotion, but so is journaling. So you have it easily accessible, you have it affordable, you have it practical. It's something you can tangibly do. You can pick up the pen, you can start to write. And it is this beautiful pathway that allows this expression that moves all that is within us and gives it that external place to rest. It is, right now on social media, my algorithm is filled with all sorts of things about writing being beneficial. So that's my algorithm feed on Instagram, for example. It might not be
They're worse
everybody's.
feeds, worse
Yeah,
algorithms. Yeah.
but there's some beautiful illustrations out there about if you imagine your inner world and it feels all like a gray cloud or like a tangled up knot, but then you go to write, it's this transference, it's this alchemization, it's this movement. Like you get to get all of that angst and tangledness outside of yourself, and by articulating it and putting it to words, like that gift of language that God has given us to name things, it's just journaling just has so much. It's the tool, it's the pathway. It's a way to move from chaotic to finding calm. It's a way of untangling those knots, of de-stressing yourself, of removing the things that you're carrying, of a spiritual release, of a spiritual practice of release and surrender and trust. And again, like there's so much research and science out there that talks about if you are able to find a healthy, expressive form of writing or journaling, it needs to do two things. It needs to be true and honest about your experiences. It needs to connect to how you feel about it. And I would argue the third thing is about what is the choice that you have in it. And all of this is in alignment with what I see in scripture and God's heart. And so um, I feel like I'm just going to start rambling here because I mean, there's books upon books upon books written about how journaling can be cathartic and healing and a spiritual pathway. And it really, really, truly can. So I hope somewhere in there I answered your question.
No, yeah, I think you did. I was thinking too, sometimes when you just have a good cry, like it's the same idea.
Yeah,
It's like you get it out of your system.
right. It's that
It's not
release.
like you're healed, but there is a sense of like, like you had to unload that.
Yeah.
And journaling, I think, would be the same thing, different
Yeah.
mode, but the same idea. Um, and you mentioned that there's like this cathartic side, and then there's
Mhm.
also a craft side to journaling and to writing, that something that begins as a very private thing, um, maybe someday, after there's been significant time and healing, it can be something that we offer a, to a reader. And so maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that, because I mean, I've talked to a lot of writers who say, write from scars, not from wounds. I think that's a really good practice. But what else would you add to that?
Yeah, I would just add that like that's the beauty of journaling and having that privacy and that personal space is you can actually metaphorically bleed onto the page. You don't have
Mm.
to worry about that, right? You can be messy, you can be You can be unfiltered. It doesn't have to make sense. It can be whatever it is. Like journaling does not have to, you don't have to make meaning when you're journaling. You don't have to. You don't have to make something of it. You don't have to tie it with a pretty bow. The cathartic side is really just kind of what you and I were just talking about, which is this process of finding release and an expression. And for me, I really believe in then returning kind of to that agency of like, what are my choices in this? What is God calling me to do next? How can I have my needs met and whatnot? But for the most part, if we can find a way to journal in a way that's cathartic, that would be beautiful and amazing. And I do believe that if you are doing any kind of writing, it also can be cathartic. I would consider myself kind of an expert in this topic, but I'm not going to be like prescriptive in that there's one way to write that's like one umbrella statement of like how to do it so that it's cathartic. Um, I think that if I pick up my pen and I like compose a short prose poem, that 5 minutes, that one line, that feels cathartic to my soul because there is this part of writing for me in my writing practice and so many others where it is a form of listening to life, like capital L life, like Frederick Buechner would talk about as in God. It's a way of kind of tapping into that sacred voice and part of ourselves. And there is something that shifts when we write. There is this spiritual connection that can happen, this peace, this joy, this awe, this surprise, this delight. And even if you are writing about something that is very painful, there is something there. There is hope that can be found in kind of putting it into ink and making something of it. um, and where the line moves between catharsis and craft, it's a spectrum, I would say. I don't think there's like a clear um, answer. I think this is where it kind of goes into discernment for writers. I would always say if you have something to write about, write it for yourself first and find the catharsis in it. And then if you feel compelled to share it, because there's healing in the sharing for yourself and others, that's when the craft can kind of come into play. That's when you get to realize how can craft, like the craft of writing, what kind of strategy or tool or skill, like writing skill, can I use to really elevate my writing or to engage my reader or to illustrate this emotion. And for me, there's a joy and a fun in that when you can get to the craft side, even when I'm, for example, writing about some harder, darker themes, there is something really playful and empowering when we get into the craft of writing. So I think writers do need both sides personally. If you're somebody who's interested in sharing your writing, whether it's Instagram, a blog, a book, whatever it might be, I'm sure that you're going to find that your writing practice is probably cathartic to you. But I think it's beautiful when writers have a writing practice that's personal, just for them,
Mm.
and then also have the side of their practice that can be forward or public facing, where that does the craft matters a little bit more.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking as you were explaining that I think at first it's for us and then it's for someone else. And so the catharsis comes with us unloading, unleashing, like just getting it on the paper,
Yeah.
and then crafting can come later. But there is something like I love what Flannery O'Connor says. She said, "I don't know what I think till I read what I wrote."
Yeah.
And I think there's something so true to that because that's that cathartic part of the writing process is that it's like, oh, I didn't even know that was in there
Mhm. Yeah,
until I got
exactly.
that on
Yeah.
a page, and then you're like, oh,
Yeah.
that is the language or that is the word that kind of sums it up. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, you also, I know that you talk. This is kind of funny because it's about writer's block, but that is a real thing. And what we often think of that as like this is a craft problem. Could it sometimes be just grief or fear or exhaustion or something that we haven't quite attended to in our
Mm.
own lives. Like sometimes, we feel like, why can't I get anything out?
Yeah.
But maybe there's something more going on there.
That I love. This is such a great question because I think hearing you say that, I would have to say I don't know that writer's block is a craft issue. I
Yeah.
would have to guess, just based on my personal experience and my experience as a writing coach with all of the writers I've worked with, writer's block, I would probably have to I would have to say does come from something else internally blocking us, whether it is fear, doubt, imposter syndrome, insecurity, like something in our life that we're avoiding. I think there's a lot that we bring to the table with writer's block. And we can all have different forms of writer's block of why it might be difficult for us to find the words to write or to show up and write. When that happens for me, and it does, and I am actually in a season of facing some writer's block of my own, that is the time where I really get curious in my journaling. So, my journaling practice is not all lament journaling at this stage of my life, though when I need to, I use it. But I also use my journaling practice to explore my writing and my emotional landscape and spiritually have a place to process and listen and pray. And like when I'm blocked, I get curious, it's frustrating. I immediately want to be frustrated with myself. Like, what's going on here? Why can't I write? Why is this hard? Why am I avoiding this? Not that kind of curiosity in terms of where you're going to like start shaming yourself and being mad at yourself, but more or less of like, like what's going on here? Like what what are the curious questions I can ask with compassion, shame free about why I might be finding this difficult. Is there an unprocessed emotion? Is something in my life really weighing on my heart and that's where my thoughts are prioritized? Do I need to write about that first? Am I listening to God's voice? Am I trying to go on path A and he's leading me to pay attention to something over here? So for me, it's an invitation to get curious, ask questions, try not to get down on myself about what it is that's going on with me, and really, I think, have patience to just kind of process it out and pay attention. And so if anybody hears, I mean, we're all going to have writer's block, let's be honest. I
It
don't think
happens to us
anybody is,
all.
yeah, anybody's immune to it. And I will say also, just because we've had the conversation around grief is really going to I hesitate to say interfere with your writing, but it's going to change it because you're going through something that is requiring a lot of physical, emotional, spiritual energy. Your writing might look different in the season of grief that you're in. And so again, I think just being curious about what it is that you need or what it is that you want, or how could you practically find a way to incorporate writing that's helpful. There's also times where I have a writer friend who calls it a follow season, like where we're just going to have times where we're on like a downturn in our cycle and in our creative cycle, and it just might be a time to rest and not write. And sometimes that can be
That's
really
okay too.
frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah. And with that, there's times where like fatigue is kind of one of those limitations that I face a lot of in my life. And if I'm having a day where I'm really tired, I'm probably not going to be able to write. Like my brain is just not going to be online. And so there's just different invitations, I think, in writer's block to just realize this is something that happens. Where am I right now? What's going on in my life? What is my life asking of me? Is it to take a nap today? Is it to find a restorative practice to show up and write? And again, I feel like I can get lost in my words because there's no right or wrong. There's no like black and white prescriptive answers. But I think to kind of return to like the heart of what I heard in the question, I typically don't think writer's block is a craft issue. I do think a lot of times it's going to be the internal circumstances that are kind of impacting us. Not to negate the external things that happen, of course, and to course, like there's times we have to develop in our craft to get somewhere new, but I think there's a lot of that inner stuff we need to tend to.
Well, I mean, we live in a day where we forget that writing is a human thing,
Yeah.
right? Like we have all this AI generated
Right.
writing where it's like, yeah, we weren't meant to produce like that. And
Yeah.
we are embodied people with heads and hearts and hands and all of these internal, external things happening in our lives. And so we aren't machines. And
Right.
it's okay.
Yes.
Like I loved what you said, that it's like an invitation to be curious and not to have shame about it, not to be so hard on ourselves. Cause I think that I know I can go there pretty quickly. So I think those are really helpful distinctions. Well, I love talking about all of this stuff and I love journaling. I find it to be like such a flexible practice, like the way you've
Yeah.
described it with grief, but also exploration. And I want to give you an opportunity to share again a little bit about your journals that you've created. I looked at them this morning again, and I was just like, I'm attracted to them. Like,
Mhm.
even if I'm not going through something you know, intensely um, hard right now. I'm like, ooh, I
Yeah.
think I want that because it's so beautiful. So I just want to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about that.
Oh yeah, thank you so much. So I did create two journals, Rest, a journal for lament, and Rise, a journal for perseverance that, as we talked about, did kind of originate from my own personal experiences of just going through these like dark nights of the soul spiritually and using journaling and biblical lament to find rest. That's the first journal, like you said, kind of that is specific for a season. If you're going through any kind of loss, big or small, and you just want to find a way that is, offering you the spiritual pathway to connect with God in a very practical, helpful way to kind of give yourself the freedom to be honest and explore those thoughts while also offering you some of those guide rails. It offers you a framework to follow that biblical lament so that you can be honest about where you are, but find your way to kind of anchor yourself in God's love in those dark, dark moments. And for me, I tried to create it as this resource, kind of like you mentioned, that felt aesthetically calm and inviting and almost timeless in a way, so that it's a resource that could be a daily journal. It could be used on demand. It could be used as needed, throughout a year or a decade, or however often you might need to use it for, navigating personal emotions, or, even just when there's things that come up in my community, and I need to come to God when I'm having some really big emotions about it. I turn to my lament journal for that as well. And so that's the journal for lament, kind of for those darker, heavier times, to kind of find that safe place through the spiritual practice of journaling with God. And the second journal I created is called Rise, and that's a companion journal that you can use them together. You don't have to, but Rise is for a season of when kind of you've gone through that dark night and that dawn is coming, right? That light is coming up again in your life. You're rising back up after life has knocked you down, but it's not easy, right? It's not easy to return to a life when you're going through grief or loss or even depression. The Rise journal is there to help you with a similar but an alternative framework for kind of guiding your thoughts and emotions in a way that helps you kind of persevere and continue on and kind of find that resurrection life and that resilience even when life is hard. So it's still honoring a lot of that honesty about what's hard, but again in a different way. It's going to kind of pivot you to finding your way back to God, back to yourself, back to life, and kind of that light again. So written similarly, you could use it every day. You could use it whenever you feel like I need a little bit of a boost to get out of bed today, so to speak, whether literally or metaphorically. And they can be used together, separate. They can make beautiful gifts, if I would say so myself. If you know somebody going through a hard season or coming out of a hard season, just it's there's no answers. There's no quick fixes, right, to life and suffering. And just my hope that these journals could be received as just helpful tools in those different moments of life as we were all going to go through them.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to put your website up here, KristinVanderlip.com. That's where people can check that out. And I love that you made a companion piece, and Rest and Rise. I mean, gosh, that's beautiful. We did kind of pass this point in the conversation, but you talked about how journaling can be harmful, and she's wondered that at times. Do we get lost in our own mess? Would you like to speak more to that?
Yeah, my quick answer is yes, we can get lost in our own mess. And even in a kinder way to say it, about my speaking for myself, I am somebody who's in my head a lot. And I can get stuck in my head a lot. And I've learned that about myself. And so journaling, I need to be really careful about, because it can be another way that I'm just stuck in my head. I'm stuck in the mess. I'm making the mess worse. And I want to say, like, if you're trying journaling and you're feeling that way, we kind of chatted about this. If we can try to refrain from shame and judgment, that would be great. But if we're just noticing, this just is still feeling really messy, or maybe this is getting worse and it's not helpful, that's an invitation to my biggest piece of advice, honestly, here would be to guide your thoughts in two ways: to think about, what do I want? What action can I take to get there? And a little bit of a manual journaling in there, if anybody's familiar with a manual journaling, of just kind of listening for God's voice, God's loving voice, trying to move into that space, can help us not get stuck in the mud or muddy the water even more. And I will say something with the rest journal that I kind of mention within the journal is, sometimes if our thoughts are really messy, or even, to be honest, really dark, this is why I love journaling as a spiritual practice, because we're tapping into the source of light. Like, if we return to that, I'm tapping into the source of light. I'm tapping into a source greater than I, who has space for my mess. What words can I borrow of God's to anchor my heart? So I can just, blurt all over the page and be as messy as I want to be. But ultimately, if I can end my journaling session with something of clarity, something defined by God's love, that's my aim. That's my heart. That would be my encouragement for most of us. If journaling without a framework is not working for you, and you're just showing up to a blank page, and that's really hard, it is really hard. I will do a little plug. I have a free downloadable journaling framework on my website, where it's like a three-part framework to kind of move through that kind of cathartic side if you're just trying to process life and emotions. That could be helpful for not, kind of like as Amy said, you making things messier.
Well, and I love that agency piece at the end, because it can become just this big pity party,
Yes.
of getting lost in all our emotions. And it's
Yes.
just this echo chamber
Yes.
of disaster, but to have at the end, and you see that in the Psalms, where like David dumps out his heart, but then I came back to the house of the Lord. There's this piece of hope, and I remembered what was true, and all of that.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, Amy. Yeah.
When you mentioned the neuroscience of actually writing things down, and I think that you don't get as bogged down in the cycle of continuing to repeat all of the bad stuff when you write it down, because you've got it out of your head. And that is, actually a proven thing. 35 years ago, I was working for an agency that I had parents calling and complaining about the volunteers that their children were under many times. And I got to a point I couldn't take in all the information. I said, could you please write that down for me? That would help me deal with, whatever you need
Mm,
me to take care of. And I would go through exactly those things. What is the problem? What do you expect me to do about it? How
yeah.
can we make it right? And it immediately put the power back in their hands,
Yeah.
number one, but it also made them responsible. It wasn't my problem. It
Yeah.
was, and I think that the nice thing about journaling is, there doesn't have to be somebody that's reading it on the other end or figuring out, what needs to be done but like you said, you just pour it all out to the Lord, and he's not judgmental of us
Yeah.
in how we do it. I am not good at journaling. Um, I wish I was better at it, but
I've got to ask really quick, what does that mean that you're not good at it? Say
I
more.
pick up my journal every so often when I just really feel like I have to write, and usually
Gotcha.
it's prayers.
Yeah.
It's not always lament, but it's just like, you know, how I'm processing things with the Lord. And yeah,
Yeah.
I don't have these journals like, we have some of our ancestors' journals where they actually, talk about what was happening during that time. And we have somebody,
Yeah.
talked about what was going on right after the Civil War. And I mean,
Oh,
wow. Yeah. And I wish that I had, I don't know. I just, it's not, I'm like, well, I don't know. Do I need to start doing that now? Maybe.
that's a great question. I hear a great question to ask yourself. I'll say too, just like for permission, if anybody in the room needs it or anybody who listens, um, I did start cultivating in about 2017 a consistent daily journaling practice. Prior to then, I was sporadic, and I always felt bad kind of that I wasn't more consistent or that I had the blank journals filling my shelves. But, I didn't really cultivate the consistent daily practice until there was a part of me that couldn't not do it. And so I feel like ask yourself,
Yeah.
I have a little guidebook called Ink and Insights on my website where the first kind of opening section of the guidebook talks about like, empowering you in your own journaling practice of like, what do you want it to look like, and figuring out the answer to that question by like, what do you need in the season? So, I'm never going to say somebody has to adopt my exact journaling practice because that's the way, like that's the way that's the truth. No, it's what has worked for me. It's backed in some research. It's helpful to others. I share it. And also it's really about empowering people to find the practice that supports what they need in their life in this season. And so, I'll also add to which I didn't mention, is that I don't really journal to keep narrative records about memories. I know a lot of people who do that, and there's times where I kind of wish I did. So I'm kind of like asking a similar question. Should I start to
Mm-hmm.
do that? I don't know, but I'm asking it. I'm listening. For me, it's like I really hope my journals get burned at some point,
Right.
I ask you about
if and
that.
when I die. Like
Yeah.
it's a mess of like this internal, imperfect, really like emotional life processing. So it's messy, like Amy said. And so, anyways, I just share that, Carrie, to like give yourself, it's okay that you don't not a quote unquote successful journaler, but if you're noticing, there's something that's not working and you want it to be looking differently, then that's like, what is there to listen to there? What might I want to be doing?
I was going to ask you about that, Kristin, about do you ever find it helpful to go back and reread your grief journals, for example, or your rise journals? Like, is that helpful, or is it one of those things too where you're like, I don't want to revisit that?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And I think it's a question I hear a lot of journalers in general, like asking in communities. It's kind of like a hot button topic to read or to not read your past journals. I will say I don't typically reread them, but on occasion I will if I'm I'm thinking of a couple of things. One, there's been times where I'm like, how many times have I prayed this prayer? How long has this season of suffering been going on? there's times where I'll go back and I'll look, and it's not necessarily discouraging to me. In some ways, it's just kind of validating of the experience of like, okay, this is where I've been. And others, when I do just kind of my blank free stream of conscious journaling, which I'm still kind of incorporating a lot of the frameworks that I've created, I'll go back to those if I am trying to remember when something might have happened or when I was going through something, and I can't remember because I have a terrible memory. And there are times when I want to go back and I want to go like, wait, what happened then? And like, what was my headspace? What was my heart space? What was I asking? Or wait, I know that I went through this thing 2 years ago. Where did I see God speaking or moving then? Like what happened then that I might have forgotten now? Because I have tons of like spiritual amnesia too at times. So to go back and see like the written record also of like God's faithfulness at times. But most of the time, I'll be honest, I don't go back and read. I just let them kind of be these containers that hold those things.
Good. That's a good word.
I have to say hi to Rachel really quick. I know Rachel. Hi, Rachel.
Hi, Kristin. Thank you so much for this. Everything you shared, it's just so beautiful. And like, yeah, I'm new to Kristin's Pen and Mend group, and it's so life-giving. I love it.
So glad.
I wanted to say, so I'm a big journaler too. And I work with women who are going through like betrayal trauma, intimate betrayal. And so I'm working on a book right now in that niche or genre and for these women. And so I've been going back to read some of my journals, and which I had not done before now. And it's been so interesting to just see like the emotion and the lament and the grief and just how everything was just pouring and spilling out during this time. And it has been helpful to, as I am writing the book, to just remember and to think about. And so, but I'm like you, I'm kind of like, I want these burned. The minute I die, burn my journals.
Yeah.
But so I just thank you for this conversation and everything that you shared. So, and the work.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.
I love that. I think, Rachel, you hit on something really, really important too for writers, just that it is so helpful to go back in our writing practice, because sometimes if you're writing about old things, like you had enough distance from something that you're like, I don't really remember what it was like to be in that space. And even though sometimes that's hard to revisit, it's helpful in your writing.
Yeah.
With somebody else. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of content in all of our journals, right? I'm sure there's a lot of content.
Some juicy stuff in there.
Yeah, there's a part of me where my sons are now almost, well, one's 15, one's almost a teenager, he's 12. And there is a part of me that's like, do I allow my sons to read my journals ever? Like, should I pass away and die one day when I will, like, should I let them inherit my journals and do with them what they will? Because there's a part of me that's like, I think it would be really enlightening for them, should they be curious, to like understand their mother from a very human lens. And then there's other times where it's like, nope. I need to like go through and like redact.
That big black Sharpie.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I don't know.
Yeah. To burn or not to burn is another probably hot topic question, right? Yeah. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, Kristin. This has been really, really good. I think we've all really enjoyed it, and it's been a good reminder of all of the ways that journaling is a healing and practice, cathartic. It helps with all of life. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to put your website up again, and so people can get a hold of those resources that you've mentioned. So thank you. Thank you for being here, and you all have a great day.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Are you ready to grow in the art and heart of writing? Visit us at mywritersblock.com to learn more about our memberships. We can't wait to see you around the block.